Change requires honesty and vulnerability. And if we are not vulnerable in our position as servants to schools and districts, if we are not honest about where we are, how can we expect others to be?
Hey everybody, welcome back to Leading Through Unprecedented Times. I am so fired up for this episode today. This next episode featuring the one and only Eric Sheninger, my good friend. Eric, thanks for being on the podcast. How you doing, my friend?
Oh, I like that introduction, the one and only. Excited to be here, Tom, and chat about the status of education in these interesting times.
Yeah, well, here we are in 2022, and what a absolute crazy year. You know, so many times you and I get to spend a lot of time around the country with districts, and all the hope looking towards this year about a year ago was some sense of normalcy, some sorts of like reduced chaos. And we get to both speak to so many principals, superintendents, and teachers, and we're hearing kind of the complete opposite. And one of the themes of this podcast this year is really around people working through adversity, but the sense of resilience. And we see it from coast to coast. You're somebody districts bring in all across the world, truly. So you get to see a lot. Talk to us a little bit about what you're seeing in terms of teachers or principals, whoever it might be, maybe a story of resilience and what you're seeing.
Yeah, it's interesting because as we ventured into 2021, people were like, all right, you know what? It cannot be worse than 2020. And from the lips of teachers and administrators, this year has been more challenging. And, you know, I wish there was a course in college called Pandemic 101, which, by the way, none of us have had. And, you know, I shared early on when COVID started to shift schools to remote and hybrid, that educators were flying the plane and building at the same time, which we still are. You know, with the new variant, you know, we're seeing cases at all-time highs, and teachers and administrators were already at their wits' end. But, you know, when we look at education through time, one thing that's really defined educators, whether you're a teacher, administrator, coach, support staff, bus driver, custodian, is this sense of resilience. And what we've seen is with no real research-based mode for professional learning, teachers and administrators and also others that have served kids have had to figure it out. And I say that with the utmost respect because, you know, in a sense, we still are in this sense of unknown, and we are still trying to find not the best strategy, but those that will empower learners, but also keep it from a sense of not adding another layer. Here's the one thing I hear over and over again. Eric, we are taxed. We are trying to deal with parents, with contact tracing. We can't have it be just another thing thrown on top of the mix. So the key when we think about transforming culture in this challenging times is how do we make it practical? And as I think about the stories that I've been a part of, you know, I've been in, I can't even count how many classrooms during the pandemic. So I've been able to see it from a bird's eye approach. But, you know, I look at, you know, one of my districts in upstate New York, Arlington Central. And, you know, just like every other district, they've been challenged. But what I've seen here is that openness and willingness to ideas that are not pie in the sky, that aren't fluff, that are going to actually improve what they can do in that period of time. And where I've seen teachers succeed the most is when they aren't challenged per se, but they are enlightened as to how they can use the time they have differently. And that would be my message to every teacher and administrator is don't reinvent the wheel. Work smarter, not harder. And what that means is looking at the time that you have right now and think about those small changes you can make. Because here's the one thing, when we combine resilience with the pandemic is educators in the classroom can only control one thing, and that's the time they have with their kids. And if we start to use that more, I guess, in an impactful way, it starts to alleviate the pressure off both teachers and administrators who, again, are, I wouldn't say looking for new ideas or new solutions. They're just trying to get through each and every day. And, I think those of us on the outside, myself, you, and others, all we can do is say thank you. And it's something that you do all the time, Tom, when at the end of your sessions. But, we have to thank every educator for the resilience, for the determination, for showing up, for persevering in this time that none of us can predict.
Yeah, so well said. And I appreciate you keeping that in the podcast here and just truly thanking anybody in education right now and the work that they're leading. I want to dive a little bit further into what you just shared, because one of the things I respect so much about your work, you mentioned being practical, but you also mentioned some of the work you're doing side by side. And we know from professional learning, one of the most effective aspects of actually shifting practice is that side by side coaching. And that's something you're doing literally every day around the country through this ICLE where you work. And so talk to us a little about kind of what you do in that regard, but talk to us about some of the change in practice. One of the things I love is watching what you share out in your newsletter and your blog every single week. You give such practical examples, practical feedback, things that you're seeing for people to be able to shift practice. So tell us just for a moment about some of the work you do with ICLE, but then some of the practices that you've seen. You're working a lot in personalized learning and with choice. And I continue to see from Hawaii to Mississippi to Texas to New York that you just mentioned all across that the work that you're doing. So talk to us a little about the work that you do, but then also about what you're seeing in terms of shifting practice to a more personalized approach here in the pandemic.
Yeah, and I'll take a step back. I think when we look at the resilience of educators, through that resilience, we've been able to see some amazing lessons that have created opportunities to, whether we call it rethink, reimagine, transform, whatever we want to call it, and looking at, innovative practices that we saw as isolated back in the day that are now mainstream, using learning management systems. You mentioned personalized learning, focusing on the SEL foundation that our kids need. But, as I get into classrooms and in schools, what I've had to do is sort of take a step back. And I think that one lesson I've learned is it's not about me. It's not about my idea. Nobody wants to hear that. Nobody wants to hear, oh, it's Eric's way or it's ICLE's way. And what I've tried to do, and it's been amazing for me, I can honestly say that I've learned just as much, if not more, from the teachers and schools that I've worked with. And I'll give you a few examples. I was challenged early on during the pandemic because frustrations are at an all-time high. And I was challenged by a staff, and they basically said, oh, you know what? Why are you here? This is just another thing. This too shall pass. I mean, they said it to me and I was hurt. But here's the thing, if we can't get past our own, I guess, mental blocks and frustrations, how can we then serve those that are looking for help? So after that, sort of awakening, I went back to my hotel room and I said, you know what? And this was not said to me per se, but when I reflected, I came to the conclusion that I was not doing a good enough job modeling the different practices that I was giving teachers and administrators feedback on. And it became such a launch pad for me to be a better coach, to be a better leader. And what I did that night was I created a model lesson. a model lesson that had a purposeful do now, anticipatory set, checking for understanding, purposeful use of technology, closure, and meaningful homework. And what I did was I built it in the context of the time period that they had. And that was on, they wanted to be on Voice and Choice. And I'll tell you this, Tom, it was one of the best things that I've ever done in my career. And what I learned was how much the teachers and administrators truly appreciated it, because I got feedback. I didn't ask for it, but the emails and texts started getting sent to me, how much they appreciated me putting myself in their shoes. Then, and then I've used that as sort of a foundation. People want you to truly be empathetic and honestly have that concern and empathy of what they're dealing with. So then another situation happened where a couple of days before, I got a curveball and everything we had planned was changed by the principal. And here I am, and I'm human. I was frustrated. I was annoyed. I might have yelled some colorful metaphors out the window, but I again reflected. And after I got past that, again, my own mental issues that I'm still trying to deal with, I developed my first truly personalized activity where I came back. And after I had teachers go through that model lesson, I then transitioned to a personalized activity where they got to either go and work on a playlist, a choice board, or they were able to come to me for one-on-one or small group conferencing to work through unit and lesson plans. And again, the feedback that I got was so empowering. So, and what I then get to do is go into the schools and see what that follow-up looks like. And I'm seeing those changes to practice, Tom. And that's kind of coming back to it, is when we talk about change, leadership is not telling people what to do. Leadership is taking people where they need to be. And it's not go do this, you must do that, this is the best idea. And we talk about resilience, but I also think we think about change. Change requires honesty and vulnerability. And if we are not vulnerable in our position as servants to schools and districts, if we are not honest about where we are, how can we expect others to be? And, through the honesty and vulnerability, I feel that I've become a better teacher, a better leader. But to see these examples firsthand and have teachers and administrators come back and say, oh my goodness, Eric, this is a better way. This is working. We are making inroads. We are, tackling the emotional and social stresses that we're having. I mean, that's, I think, the best part of the job. And to come back full circle, I never have a plan. I always ask teachers and administrators, what is it you need? And how can I help you get there? And that is a far cry from having everything planned and everything scripted. But the message is, hey, everybody, you could have a great lesson plan, a great unit plan, but things will change. And the thing is, you got to be confident in your own abilities. And what I'm trying to empower them is, how will they empower their kids, their students, to be more collaborative, not just with lessons and assessments, but administrators, how will they really bring in voice and choice to create cultures that truly work for kids?
I absolutely love that. And I think you're modeling just in that sense. I love the examples that you gave there, but truly modeling to leadership, what leadership's all about. You're talking about vulnerability, talking about reflection, talking about meeting people where they are, talking about modeling the process. Let's talk for just a few minutes. I know you get to coach principals and superintendents as well across the board and work really closely with them. What advice do you have for them? Here we are kind of midway through that year. We know both Dan Pink's work, that when and kind of that midpoint in the the year, that lull, and we're certainly here now early in 2022. So talk to, if you would, just for a few minutes, principal superintendents, what advice do you have for them to finish this year strong?
Yeah, and I'll go back to the theme of honesty and vulnerability, which truly breed resilience. And, they are looked to have all the answers. And I will tell you that the stress and pressures on those in classrooms, it is just, I can't even describe what it's like. But we can't forget that the pressures and stresses also are impacting school leadership. And what I tell them is the best way they can support their staff is to be honest and vulnerable. And the two most powerful phrases that they can, make public to their respective staffs is, it's okay to say, I don't know, and I need help. Because no one has, the definitive guide or blueprint for how to navigate through these unprecedented times. And, what I've told them is, you got to go back and understand that the tenets of leadership are so more paramount today. Clear communication, collaborative vision, support. What does that support look like? The thing that I tell teachers, that I tell school leaders is, if anyone sees their PD day meetings as just another run of the mill, here we go again, we're going through agenda items, we're doing things in isolation, that is going to put even more stress, pressure, frustration on teachers. One thing that I've seen from many of the school leaders that I've been working with is how they are going out of their way to provide more time for their staff, whether it's extending Thanksgiving break, whether it's building in one day a month for teachers just to plan. It's little things like that. I'm watching administrators go in and they're covering classes for teachers who either need time to plan or just need that mental break. Going back to, I don't want to say old school, but more personal, handwritten notes, thank yous. People don't need, things that, like donuts and coffee and all. It's great. But what they want is time. And, one thing that I've done to help with modeling that vulnerability and honesty is every school leader that I'm blessed to work with, I say, have you polled your staff as to what they truly need right now? It's very simple, Tom. Anyone can do it. The hard part is when you get that feedback, not to take it personally, not to view it as an indictment on your leadership, but to, sift through it and see what has value. Because when I get teachers, and I try to convey that message, I ask them, well, what do you need? Time is the number one thing. They don't want more things thrown at them. They want that time. So, looking at those aspects, and listen, it's okay. No one has all the answers. And I've had some very difficult conversations from a sense of the emotional strain on school leaders, but they're human too. Everyone is human in this endeavor. And, together we are better. So taking that step back, finding out what people truly need, and also being a co-learner. The one thing that empowers educators, teachers in particular, is when their school leaders are actually in the trenches with them, learning shoulder by shoulder. And that's another thing that I try to convey when I work with leadership teams is you got to be part of the solution. And we hear that a lot when we talk about change. So, those are just some of the few things, but, we also can look at just the concept of grace and how, whether you're a leader, teacher, coach, whatever your position is now is the time to extend grace to yourself, but also think about consciously how you do that to those that you work with, because everyone needs those little pick-me-ups right now. And it doesn't matter their role, but simple things such as, I understand, I want to help. What can I do? What do you need? And then acting on it.
Yeah, so well said, Eric. You've given us so many nuggets of wisdom throughout. And late last year, you launched a new book as a multiple best-selling author, but you launched Disruptive Thinking in Our Classrooms, preparing learners for their future, where you drop lots of wisdom throughout the book, lots of inspiration. Talk to us for just a minute or two, if you would, just some key themes to the book, because it is a great resource for leaders, for teachers in classrooms right in this moment of resilience for them. So talk to us, if you could, for a moment about that resource.
Yeah, and Disruptive Thinking was my pandemic project. And what I try to remind everyone is, just because we are in the most disruptive time in education, we can go back to right before the pandemic, and we were in, at that point in time, the most disruptive moment in time, which was the fourth industrial revolution, which we're still in it now. And here's the thing, disruption is only going to become more prevalent in the world. And what I tried to do was push myself outside the perceived area of writing for me. Eric is the technology guy. Eric is the leadership guy. So I wrote a book for primarily classroom educators. And the one thing that I wanted to really hammer home was, chase growth, not perfection. Let's really look at our practice and think about those incremental steps that we could make. And in writing this book, I tried to utilize the crystal ball that I could loan out to you whenever you need it, Tom, and think about, well, what are educators going to need 5, 10 years from now? Well, it's not any different than what they need now. Practical research-based strategies, but also those stories of how teachers and administrators are implementing those and getting actual results. So when I wrote Disruptive Thinking, it really was part practical guide, part inspirational journey, but to actually see firsthand what those educators in the trenches have done. And, to try to sum it all up, what is disruptive thinking? It's how do we empower our students to replace conventional ideas with innovative solutions to authentic problems. By using that definition, we can clearly see that we are always going to have these authentic problems. But if we keep using conventional ideas and approaches, if it's a one size fits all, if it's cells and bells, desks and rows, the archaic school day, if we don't make those changes, we're not going to be able to future-proof learning for our kids. And that is the whole mantra with the book, is not about another thing we need to do, but coming back to the focus of resilience and time. How do we do what we already do better? Get those results that invigorate teachers and administrators, remind us of why we do what we do, but how can we do it better, and what will tell us if we're successful.
Yeah, one of the things I respect about your work tremendously, before we get to our last question here, is how often you refer back to the evidence, back to the research, and make sure things aren't just some fly-by-night, latest and greatest, but really, what does the evidence show? And I've always really respected that about your work. So I have one more question for you before we go. You get to see so much across the world, truly in classrooms every single day. What is it right now in early 2022 that gives you hope?
What gives me hope is that resounding why. Why did you become a teacher? Why did you go into education? And when I see firsthand teachers and administrators doing their thing, working miracles, making the impossible possible. When I see them through all of this adversity, still showing up, still caring, that's what gives me hope, Tom. And we see the headlines, this mass exodus. We know it's there, but what gives me hope is, that remembering, why we became teachers, why we wanted to serve and give more time to other people's children than sometimes our own. So what gives me hope is the passionate, dedicated, amazing educators who through it all are still doing their thing for kids and are still part of the noblest profession on the planet, because without educators, most other professions will not exist. So what gives me hope is also my hope that we continue to strengthen, support those people on the front lines and make sure that they know that we appreciate everything that they are doing for kids and for each other.
Couldn't agree more. So well said. For people that want to follow your work or connect, how can they reach out? Where can they connect?
Yeah, I'm pretty easy to find. EricSheninger.com, Twitter, E_Sheninger. Just put in my first initial last name and I will pop up all over the web, including Pinterest and Snapchat.
Awesome. That's Eric Sheninger, everybody. Eric, thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks for having me, Tom.